How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Summit County and beyond high country winter fly fishing presentation by myself, Zeke Hersh, Trouts Frisco's general manager, and I run the outfitting for Trouts as well, for all of Trouts. And I've been guiding up here in Colorado for 20 plus years, I think more like 25 years total. And that's up in Summit County. So I've got a ton of experience, and a lot of that experience really just came from looking at maps and whether it was Google Earth and back in the good old days in paper maps, and finding places that I wanted to go fish, looking at roads along rivers, and really just taking a drive and figuring out where good spots are, looking for reservoirs and dam releases and all that kind of good stuff. And we're going to get into a little bit of that. Real lucky in Colorado to literally have 365 days a year that we can fish and fly fish, in whether that's fishing some actual tailwaters or freestones. So super lucky. When I moved from Washington State, I really enjoyed that aspect of being able to fish year-round for trout on tailwaters, and also just get to banana belt area. So, the Arkansas River Valley, or even sometimes later in the season as we get out of winter in the lower Colorado, and even in the Pump House area. So super awesome ability that we have here in Colorado to fish year round. As far as getting into that 360 days access and availability, the first little point that we're going to come to is winter weather. Right now we got a little storm up here in Summit County. It's not making for horrible driving, but that's definitely been windy. This is the first wind effect that we've had. And, I was up doing some backcountry skiing yesterday, and it was quite cold up top. So that's something I'm always thinking about, is that wind. And with that wind, usually what I'm really thinking about is your winter driving conditions. So driving up to go fish Buena Vista area from Summit County, if you're driving on 285 from Fairplay to BV, that can be a pretty hazardous stretch. So, watching out for those hazardous routes. Another route is heading up from Frisco or Silverthorne, heading up to Kremling. That's a super dangerous, and it's almost more dangerous just because the wind does rip through there, but it ices up good. We got wildlife on the road. That's gotten a lot better with the big tall fence that they built there a few years back, but also just tons of traffic. It's a very busy route from Steamboat, so there's a ton of traffic on there. So these are just some of the things that I'm thinking about as I'm preparing for where I'm going to go. And as far as conditions go, 365 days a year, you got that exposure. So when I'm thinking about not only the drive, I'm also thinking about, all right, so it's going to be windy. If I'm fishing the Dream Stream, I'm going to be exposed, and I'm going to have to deal with that wind. And that's not necessarily a horrible thing at the Dream Stream, as far as, there's so many bends on that river that you can get your back to that wind, but it might be for an uncomfortable day. So exposure, the wind, and then inversions are another good thing to think about. Up on the Colorado River, up in the Kremling area, sometimes there's just a weird weather inversion, and it gets really cold. It could be 30 degrees in Summit County up in Breck, and it's 2 degrees, if not even colder, in Kremling. So, as I'm preparing, I'm really looking at my weather forecast, looking at temperatures around, and I'm doing this the day before or a couple days before, and looking at seeing what those forecasts are looking at going to happen. That said, I've also had days where I've looked at wanting to go to the Kremling area and looked at the forecast that's going to happen, and the day of that inversion did happen. It was completely different than the actual reported wind or wet weather that we were getting reported. And then a nice thing about fishing around here is those lower altitude options. So getting down to Salida on the Arkansas, or getting down to Glen Springs on the Roaring Fork or the lower Colorado or the Frying Pan. A lot of times I'm looking at those options. And then as we get into areas to fish in the winter, one thing I'm trying to stay away from for the most part is also canyons. So really trying to steer away from canyons just because they don't get as much light. And that usually means colder temperatures. If you've ever been to the Taylor River, super cold, and it doesn't have a whole lot of warm times. It doesn't necessarily mean the fishing's bad. It's just you're going to have to deal with some of those cold temperatures. And also bear in mind too, sometimes I'm fishing with clients and trying to give the best options and experience for those people. And so maybe a canyon and freezing your fingers is not the first thing you're thinking of. Whereas if you're going out for yourself and you do not mind to be really cold for the first few hours of the day or whatnot, and you know you want to catch those big fish in there, that can be a good option. And then other things I'm thinking about is ice flow. So as I'm looking at these weather reports, and let's say I'm wanting to go to fish the Arkansas, but the temperatures have been in those single digits for the last couple days, that gives me a good idea that we're going to deal with some ice flow in the morning and maybe all day. And so, depending on how warm it gets. So that's one other thing that I'm going to think about as I'm making these decisions. And then bank ice is another option that you're going to have to deal with. And I really do like to fish the upper Colorado sometimes, so even in the Pump House or Radium area. However, a lot of ice will start forming on the edge of the river, and it makes it a little treacherous to step on. That area gets real thick. Some areas it's actually thin, and you still have to step on that ice and potentially break through or slip on the ice. So it's a dangerous scenario. On the Colorado, it's usually quite thick and you can walk out there, but I still see it crack. And that's definitely something to worry about. And then, excuse me, anchor ice is something we really have to worry about too. Low flows will cause some anchor ice. And, also that ice flow that's happening, that can be anchor ice releasing. But it's something that if you've had a really cold stretch and now you get a ton of anchor ice on there, that's going to actually cause some degraded fishing, some not very good fishing. So something to think about. Again, looking at those weather reports and deciding, like, oh, it's been in the single digits for a week now. That might not be the best option. And also, and we're going to throw this all in there. Combining all this info with your weather, with your flows, and then how you want to access this stuff as far as your drive and whether or not you're walking in. And then that brings us to the next point of 365 days of access in your winter accessibility. So, some places you can drive right up to. I got a question. Yes,
Zeke,
sir.
we're not in the business of giving out free ads, but what do you like to use to get your weather reports?
I like to use Weather Underground. That's one of my favorite websites there, and it's got little weather stations at different areas around, and it's actual getting this data from these small weather stations. So it's pretty accurate. Very rarely is it really wrong. All right, guys. So back to winter accessibility. So some places we can drive right up to, walk right to the bank and start fishing pretty easily from the parking lot. However, some of the places I like to fish maybe have a hike, and just like everything these days, every spot that most of us fish that's easy access has been busy. So when I'm going out to fish for myself, I really like to try to find places that are a little harder to get to. And so whether it's a hike, I'm looking at, okay, I want to hike into somewhere. Did it just snow a foot and a half? If it did, it's going to be deep snow, and I'm going to have to deal with that. And or if I have clients, they're going to have to deal with it. So those are a lot of those decision making processes in what's happening with that weather. So deep snow, long hikes, you might have to deal with that. If you're up for that, then it's great. A lot of times that can be great fishing. So it's going to keep the people out of there, and you're going to have maybe a good quiet day on the river in the winter. And that's one of the beauties about winter fly fishing is there's not a ton of people out there, especially to these harder to get areas. If you spend the time, a lot of times you'll have some good solitude. We talked about bank ice. There's definitely areas where you've got to think about, all right, am I going to be able to access the river because of so much bank ice, or is it going to be completely iced over? So that's something to think about. But that also said, some days in the wintertime, as if I'm got a little cabin fever, and I think Yvonne has actually came with me. We've just drove the trough road, literally from Dotsero all the way up, and jumped out in little spots to go fishing. And turned out it was more of a drive, if I remember one of the days. But we did catch some fish. We did get out and fish, and probably should have reversed our way of approaching that day. But it was a cool way to see what's happening on the river. And for me, a lot of times that's just a good day to get out of this, out of the mountains and up in Summit County and get out of the snow and just go check it out. Another thing to think about is road closures. So, if I'm going to the upper Colorado in the partial area, very rarely do they close Ute Pass Road, but that's one of my favorite ways to go. But you never know; it could close, or Vail Pass. Like that's one thing that if you're trying to get over to fish the lower Colorado, you might run into a road closure and have to be rerouted all the way through Leadville or up to the Trough Road, and maybe that road, that drive is going to be a little sketchy. So just things to think of. And then, also some winter closures. Not many of the streams in Colorado have seasonal closures, but make sure you check and make sure that section of stream that you're going to does not, or that it consistently ices over. That can definitely be a situation. So just know before you go. Make good choices. For instance, like if you want to fish the Upper Platte, I just drove it the other day, and every winter it freezes. But if you want to fish Tomahawk, it's not going to be an option. So, yes, sir.
Road closures. Where do you find those? What's your source there?
Road closures. I'm usually looking for CDOT. So that's a good thing, especially if you are driving. You're leaving to fish in the morning. Look at CDOT, see if the Vail Pass is closing anything, and you can also look. There's a bunch of good cameras on their website. That's another thing that besides the CDOT cameras, there's a bunch of cool cameras all over the state that if you just search like Glenwood Springs webcam, or just the other day I was looking at Buena Vista webcam more to go ride my bike and notice how much snow is there. You can actually, there's webcams all over and they're online. So good little thing. Like definitely Glenwood. I'll look on there if I want to float, and I'll just see there's a kayak park and just see if there's ice flow on that webcam. In the summer, I'll also look at that same webcam if there's been a rain event. I will look on that webcam to see if I can see any clarity situations from that rain event. If I saw a spike on the crystal or something, and just see what that Glenwood Springs cam looks like. So CDOT, check those cams; those are great options. Yeah, another question.
I think we're going to cover this later on, but might as well get to it now. Judas is asking how to keep his feet warm.
We're going to definitely cover that. You know, foot warmers; those are great. Was hearing a little blurb on a news station or something the other day about how to keep warm, and it's basically layers. So, and that can also be like one of my friends. He swears because he guided a lot in the wintertime by boot fit waders. So having that little bit of extra air between your skin and so it can warm up and keeps that warm. But then also some people have actually got electric socks now. That's a big thing in skiing industry. So those are also something that you can use for fly fishing in the winter. And I guess there's more and more companies making them. So I know I just saw somebody with uh, ski socks for those. So those are good options. And then we'll go into more of those other options. All right, so make those good choices. Know before you go. Those are some great options as far as the CDOT and cams. Just checking those weather. I mean, as a professional guide, those are things that I'm always going through the days before, looking at weather, looking at wind, looking at the cameras, looking at flows, looking at all of those things to make the best decision for clients and days. As I was guiding in Florida, looking at tides and tides in certain different areas. So putting all those together to give the best experience, not only for yourself but for your clients. So those are the first parts that you want to start going to. And then now you're like, all right, options. Where are we? Looked at the weather. Now we're going to add in those options. And we talked about it early in the fact of tailwaters. So we got a ton of tailwaters in Colorado. One of the things that makes it such a optimal place to do some winter fly fishing. We got the blue below Dillon Reservoir right here, and it's been fishing really good. Williams Fork below Williams Fork Reservoir, also a phenomenal fishery. You just have to hike into that area. South Platte below Spinney Mountain Reservoir, which is the Dream Stream. Again, phenomenal fishery. Taylor River below Taylor Reservoir, cold but huge fish. And to be honest, like the winter is probably the time you want to go there. Summer, there's so many people out there. Winter is going to weed out a few of those people. Maybe those fish haven't seen a million flies, floating by them, and it's just a good time to be there. And maybe that low light too you're able to trick those fish a little easier. Frying pan below Rudai, again, cold area, but again, maybe that winter's a great time. And then yesterday we were doing a podcast with Rick and Will, and Rick, we were talking about the section below Pueblo on the Arkansas. Again, a phenomenal tailwater. I've yet to fish it, but I know how good it is, and how many of my guides tell me how awesome the dry fly fishing is. So those are just some of those options. We've got other options around the state. So those are some really good options for tailwaters. And then then we get into some pretty cool freestones, and those are free-flowing, snowmelt dependent streams. That said, in Colorado, a lot of these freestones do have some source of a tailwater usually going into. Doesn't necessarily make them a tailwater because it's usually downriver, but that might add some warmer water in there in the wintertime to help keep that freestone from melting. And then also maybe clear those flows up from silt and sediment. So the Arkansas would be one of those. The Eagle River, the Lower Colorado, the Roaring Fork, and again, most of those are going to have tailwaters as tributaries, and they keep that river from freezing. So just good options. And the nice thing about the freestones is instead of using these small bugs that you have to go to on the tailwater, there's a lot of times you can use some bigger bugs, bigger stoneflies or pheasant tails or tractor nymphs or worms and stuff like that. And these fish usually will still eat those pretty regularly. And then, I'm going to go to spring creeks. We don't have a ton in Colorado, nothing you would think of like Montana and Idaho, but we do have some spring creeks. And that's just basically water coming from underground, bubbling up from underground, and it's basically going to be warmer temps than the typical air temperature in winter. In summer, it's cooler, keeps that water nice and cold, and then keeps that water from freezing. One real easy one that if you haven't checked it out is Trout Creek on Trout Creek Pass, going down from basically Antero Junction to Buena Vista. It's a cool little stream. There's some public access right there. You can actually go to the source, see where it bubbles up out of the ground, and how warm it is because there's a bunch of green vegetation around it. And and then you'll as the stream gets bigger, go downstream and be able to see these little holding pools and catch some trout. And the trout aren't huge, but it's pretty fun to fish them in the middle of winter. And you can even just use single dry flies. So super fun. And then I wouldn't necessarily say the Upper Blue River up by Breckenridge is a tailwater, but a unique situation where when the mining came through here in the late 1800s, they used a dredge boat and basically left all these tailing piles in this river valley of the Blue River. And for a long time, think of it as filling up your bathtub with marbles. That water was just under those marbles, just flowing under those rocks, and you never saw that river there. Well, in the I think it was the late 80s, they came in and the town of Breckenridge in Summit County decided to reline that river and recreate that river. And so they basically relined that river, created that river from scratch again. And you'll see that in those stair steps. Not necessarily, that was early days of when they came through and were first starting to learn how to redesign rivers. And, it's not the most aesthetically pleasing, but it's some good holding water. If you also have a chance to go up to the Swan River, there's a new area of river that they've basically recreated and restored, and that is a little more natural looking than the blue. But back to the blue. So when they did that, there was still water that was basically underground in certain areas. They couldn't get all that water back above that lining. And so that water will bubble up, and you can actually physically see water coming out of some areas and coming back into that river system. And what that does is just keeps that water warmer. The other interesting thing is it brings a lot of nutrients into the river. And if you ever fish that area up in Breckenridge, you'll notice that after you fish that and you hang your waders up to dry, those waders are going to have a very unique earthy smell, and that's from all those nutrients. And the other thing that makes that area fish so good too is there's also a wastewater treatment plant outlet. So that's clean water coming from out of that outlet, rich in nitrogen and all kinds of nutrients. So that's also warming that water. So a good little stretch. I've been really preaching to a lot of on my fishing reports, if you've been reading them, that's a great section to fish. The fish might not be massively huge, but there's lots of them, and they'll eat small flies, big flies, they'll eat streamers all winter long. And then we're going to go back to weather. So in Colorado, we can fish 365 days a year, like we talked. I like to pick my days and locations specifically. So if I'm guiding, sometimes that doesn't work out, and I'm going to have to do that negative digit day or single digit day. Are those the days that you want to pick? Maybe not, but if that's the only day you can have, I've had some amazing dry fly situations especially on the South Platte and or the Upper Colorado, in those negative digit days or single digit days. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. As long as you prepare with what we're going to talk about down the line, I think you can have a good day even in those temperature days. So check your 10-day forecast. If you have the chance to move it around, do that for those warmer days. Some days you can look down in the Arkansas River Valley in the middle of winter, it can be 50 degrees. So, and that can be a phenomenal fishing day down there, and super warm and comfortable for you. And it makes you feel like you got out of the cabin fever, at least when I'm living up in here, because it can be just snowing forever. And you're like, man, I want to go see some cactus or something. And then look at all your potential areas. Check that high and check the low for the days, potential for snow, and check for the wind. Pick your best option. And, something to think, this is not necessarily the warmest option, because the warmest option might have a ton of wind, and then that's still going to be cold when you get 30-mile-an-hour wind. And then, also it might not be the place with the least amount of snow. And then, as we get back to that wind could cause some serious wind chill and make for an uncomfortable day. So, it might be warm, but it's going to be ripping down there. You might want to steer away from somewhere that has a little more protection from that wind. And that's, again, what I'm looking for. I'm like, Buena Vista is not going to be windy. So, as windy, it's going to be 14 miles out as opposed to 35 in Hartselle. Maybe I'll check the Arkansas. And then, this is a cool thing. And if you've ever experienced it, is sometimes on those snowy days. So sometimes you'll be like, oh, it's going to be sunny here, but it's going to be super cold. But up on the Upper Colorado, it might be, snowing, but it's going to be a little cooler, but it's going to be just snowing and not super windy. Sometimes those snowstorms actually triggers the fish to rise to not only an actual midcatch that might be happening, but just to the snowflakes. They think they're midges. And it's a pretty neat phenomenon when you see these fish just rising to the snowflakes, and you're actually throwing a little dry fly out there and they're eating them. And then, look for those potential driving routes and those potential hazardous weather situations, and then put all these factors together with your destination that you're heading to. And, this all said, I've definitely run into scenarios where you have to throw an audible. Let's say you run down to Buena Vista and it's just jam-packed with ice. Nice thing is, the Dream Stream's not that far away, and you can pull that audible and go, or Trout Creek. You can go fish Trout Creek on the way through there just to fish a couple dry flies. But you can throw that audible. So, you might choose all these things, but also kind of think that you always have that little audible play in your back pocket and make a different call. There's some areas that you might not be able to make an audible, so you're kind of stuck. But if you're going to fish the Williams Fork or Colorado, you're probably pretty good, except for the fact that you might have to deal with weather. So, and then another thing to think, we talked about it briefly, is just your flows on your tailwaters. So, winter usually is going to prevent minimal flow situation on Colorado tailwaters. So you're going to be fishing skinny water to picky trout. This can also be some great fishing though. So don't rule that out. And the fish are used to that 50 CFS, for instance, on the blue. It's been running at 50 CFS for a couple months now, so they're used to it. They found their water. Now, one thing you want to definitely steer away from is a quick drop. That can definitely freak those fish out in those winter situations. But there can be releases, but be ready for those low water situations. And then if you see that bump in the flow, that's actually the opposite. So if you see a bump on a tailwater, that's actually when you're going to want to get there. That's going to put a lot of food in the river, and usually spike that feeding activity. So for instance, when you were talking the blues around 50 CFS, you see that bump to 75 or 70 or even 10 CFS. Sometimes that's going to throw a bunch of myces and a bunch of midge larvae in the river, and those fish are going to start eating. So, and gives you those fish a little more sense of comfort too. So you can get up on those holes, and they're not going to be freaked out. And then flows on freestones, just like tailwaters. Wintertime means that freestones are at their lowest with the lack of snowmelt entering the river system. There can be spikes with snowmelt in the springtime, but for the most part, winter flow will be consistent. When you see a spike, though, especially as we get into springtime, that could also be mud in the water. So, yes, sir.
We got a question from Derek. He said on our channel, Tanner and I made a video with massive dries during winter. Would that work this season?
Massive dries.
Big dry flies.
You could definitely fish them as an indicator, and you never know. I mean, some areas you never know. I mean, I think the biggest thing with winter fly fishing and like a chubby is they tend to get ice on them. So they'll tend to start building up ice, and then they don't float very well. So, but we can get to double dries. Like in the wintertime, one of my favorite, point flies is going to be a 16 or 18 parachute atom. So, that's usually on my big spectrum. If you're fishing maybe a little spring creek, you might be able to entice a fish with a bigger terrestrial. But I think the biggest thing you got to remember, if you're using it as like a dry dropper or whatnot, you'll end up getting a lot of ice built up. One of the reasons why when I do some float fishing in the wintertime, I don't do that is just because of that. And then those flies just sink. All right. All right. So, yeah. So look for those spikes and flows, guys. In the springtime, that could be mud. And so, again, something to think about when you're seeing a freestone water get a big spike in the springtime. That could be just snowmelt coming off real quick, or maybe a little weird rainstorm in the spring. You don't get a ton of rain in Colorado, but it sure can happen. And then, just like tailwaters, if it drops too much, that's going to actually freak those fish out. And if you're watching it drop too, the problem with freestones is that sometimes that will actually enable that river to fully ice up, and that is not a good situation. The Colorado does ice up in places. It's still flowing underneath because it's got enough water in there. But like this year, we're pretty low in the winter, and that's definitely a thing to be kind of conscious of. That if it does ice over too much, that can be a serious winter kill situation on our freestone. So that can be a bad thing. We don't want those fish to die. So hopefully, we have enough flow through this winter to really not hurt those trout. Most of those fish are smart though, and they're going to retreat into those deeper holding pools. So yeah, those freestones will ice up. For instance, right now, I think when I did this flow, the Eagle, I think it roll caught was running around 120. It's pretty low for the Eagle, lower than most the last few years if you look at historical data. So, that's one of those rivers that you're hoping those fish will return, retreat to those holding waters. And then we talked about that spring spikes could be mud in the and color the water in the spring. And same thing with spring creeks in the winter. They're going to have little other water for inflow from melting snow. So these are going to be running at their lowest in the winter months. This will also bring some very technical fishing. Those fish are going to be super spooky when those leaders land on the water. So it's definitely it's interesting and fun to go check out, but you might be frustrated a little bit too, just with how scared these and where this are. So when you're going to those tailwaters, just know you're going to have a technical day. Time of day, guys, it's pretty much the middle of the day, 10 to 2 or so. It's not usually like what I like to think about. So, I still like to try, and this is what I talk to all my guides and peoples. I still like to try to be out there 9 or 9:30. And for the most part, why I'm doing that, guys, is just because, I want to, number one, I want to enjoy the day as it's warming up, but also get dialed in and tied up and on the spot, as the day's warming up. And usually that first half hour might be a little slow, trying to figure out what those fish are doing or where they're at, but also kind of letting them warm up and wake up, have their coffee, and then once that day starts warming up, you're going to start seeing some activity, 10 or 11, and you're going to start getting into some good activity, through that middle of the day. This is probably a good time of year to not have lunch at noon or 1, because that's kind of when those fish are doing their most action through that middle of the day. Maybe save that lunch for 2 or 3. Yeah.
We have a couple questions. First is from Paul. He's asking, are fish still hitting on eggs? Fishing's been tough around Trumbull. That's first part of his question, and then the second part of the question is indicator size. Does it really matter? Question mark.
Thanks, Paul. Those are good questions. I don't fish the Deckers area a whole lot. As far as I know, I think it's probably running pretty low right now. So, one technique that I always, all wintertime, and I know Yvonne likes to throw eggs too. Like, it's a good time of year to throw eggs. I did watch Yvonne's forecast, and sometimes fish see that egg as a they are like, oh man, it's a million eggs I've seen. And you throw that egg through that hole 20 times, and they get hip to it, and they're just kind of off. It's kind of indicator the fish. So sometimes if I'm feeling like they're not into it, I'll just switch to double or triple midge rig, or use that jigged Rainbow Warrior like Yvonne was talking about. It's a great pattern, flashy. It's heavy enough to get down. Usually because it's in that jigged, tied on a jig hook, it doesn't snag as much too. So it's a good little situation to use. So, I definitely use eggs all winter long. But if I'm fishing a really technical fishery, I might not use beads, first of all, because they're kind of big a lot of times. And I might just switch to micro eggs. And then if that's still not doing the trick, I'll just switch off eggs completely and just use all midges. Or sometimes, I might try a midge or a worm or something up top. And if that's still not doing the trick, and again, I think a lot of people, you all would probably agree, sometimes it's just straight confidence. And if I'm not having confidence in that rig and I'm thinking, oh, the fish are seeing the egg or whatever, I'll just switch to super basic midge patterns and really concentrate on getting the best drifts down and getting those flies down. And then as far as indicators, I typically always use that medium-size indicator. I just feel like it floats the best. So medium thingamabobber or the airlock, and I just feel like it floats the best and is going to see the best strikes. One thing for years I did do, and now I'm just probably lazy, is I used yarn, and that was a great technique, really sensitive. The problem with yarn though, in the winter months, just like the chubby, it can ice up too when you have real cold flows. So That medium size I find is good. I'm not super concerned about color either on the indicator. I tend to use just a bright color. I'd rather have my clients see that indicator than not see it. So, I mean, how many times have we all been fishing and look at the indicator, it's down, and you're like, oh yeah, it's down. I need to set that. Just anything to kind of keep you keyed into that. Any movement on that indicator is key. So, hope that helps. Yeah. All right. Good deal. So I try to be on the water 9 or 9:30, and that way I'm warming up as the day's warming up, and we're warming up my clients, getting their casting quirks done, and getting their hook sets good. And that's the other thing. So some places where it's busy, I might even try to be there a little earlier, just so I can get there before everybody does. Like the Dream Stream. Sometimes you have to be there pretty early, especially in the spring. And then some colder temperatures to start the day. But again, we talked about that. Day warms up, so does the fishing. So that's usually why even though some people will be like, "Oh man, you're leaving early. You're meeting at 8. That's early." But a lot of times we're driving an hour and a half to the destination, and that gives us a good time for warming up. That is a great way to spend the day. Catch a few fish. Fishing activity usually start around 9 a.m. and usually good to about 3. So usually 10 and 2 is the peak time, but you're going to pick up some fish early and you end a little later as well. All right, preparation. This is yes, sir. Yeah, we got a question.
So there's 2 questions, and one of them, let me start off by saying, Zeke, do you Euronymph?
I don't Euronymph. I've tried a little bit. I'll tell you what, early days of nymphing was pretty much Euro nymphing. And for me, I just haven't done it enough back in the day. And really, when I started getting indicator fishing, it was night and day how much more fish I was catching. But, again, I haven't done it now. And with all the new techniques and equipment, I'm sure it'd be a good one to check out for sure.
So Timothy Bowling had a question about check nymphing, so we will save that for a different presentation. Perhaps we'll. I know I've been talking to a couple people about potentially coming on. So, Timothy, appreciate the question. Rube Dog is asking leader lengths, feet, like how long and what size.
Yeah, so I mean, pretty typical in my bag is a 9 foot 4X or 5X leader, and I'm maybe going a little longer sometimes into that pushing to that 12 foot range, just depending on where I'm fishing. But for the most part, that 9 foot 5X leader is going to be doing great, and we're going to cover some more of that stuff in what you need in your bag for sure. All right, guys. So preparation. This is what a lot of people forget and forget about, especially those waders that you've maybe stuffed in your car from the last time that you went fishing and forgot to bring them in and dry them out, and they've been actually frozen for the last 2 weeks or whatever in your car. So drying on frozen waders are super key. And then we did touch on those boot fit waders. You're going to fish a lot of days or you're going to guide a lot of days, a good pair of boot fit waders are actually going to keep your feet a lot warmer. They're a little bulkier to move around, but it's a good thing to keep your feet warm for those cold days. Puffy coat. I definitely have a puffy coat. Yes, sir.
I'll also mention boot fit waders. You don't have to tie and untie frozen laces.
Very key. That is a key one right there. Yeah. So why not? And back in the day, my buddy, I think they were big battery packs. That's what he swore by them because he could get them in his boot fit waders for his battery socks. So, something to think about. But that's a whole other pair of waders. So, but puffy coat. I definitely have a pair of puffy pants, especially for not really wade fishing days because they're almost too warm. But when I'm doing a float trip in the winter, I have some puffy pants that I'll wear into those waders, and it sure keeps me nice and toasty. And Sims makes a great pair of them, and can't tell you how happy I am with them. I also have some Sims cold weather pants, which actually have like a fleece underneath. Those I'm wearing quite often as well, especially wade fishing. Plenty of layers. It's going to trap that air to you. In fact, when you see those fleece linings in the waffles inside, that's what those little waffle texture for, kind of little air next to your body that's going to be nice and warm. So, having those layers of fleece with those wafflings are great. Good pair of warm socks. I don't typically like to wear two socks, but then it begs to differ. Like if you're, supposed to be layering, maybe two pairs of socks are good. But I also don't like over sweating or, causing my feet to be wet from being too warm. And then you get kind of a layer of condensation on your feet or sweat on your feet, and that's causing some cold feet. And then we talked about electric socks. If you're going to do a lot of winter fishing, it's probably a good idea. My biggest thing with fishing, and I've had winter fishing, is I've had people like, "How do you do it?" And I was like, "Man, you just got to have a short memory. You just got to be like blank it out of your mind that you're like whatever, just dealing with this, and because your feet are definitely not going to freeze. You're not causing damage to your feet. I've caused more damage to my feet. In fact, Yvonne and I were talking about this earlier, playing hockey, where your hockey bag's in your car during the day and you go out and skate and you have a bunch of ice, basically crystallized ice up in that toe cap. And I've definitely bit my toes from that, from playing in an outside rink up here in Summit County. So, not that's what's, if you're in the water, you're probably not going to have frostbite. So as long as you're doing that, I think you're going to be good. But you just have to have that short-term memory loss. Yes, sir.
It's unrelated, but I want to get these questions answered. So Nathan Moore asking, is vehicle access to the Taylor tailwater challenging / risky in the winter for those of us without four-wheel drive?
Good question. I know, I'm pretty sure that Cottonwood is not open in the winter. I think the biggest thing with the Taylor is you're gonna have to drive all the way around. Um, for the most part, the canyon's not that bad. There's actually quite a few people, driving that canyon. It's just you're gonna have to go over Monarch Pass, and it's gonna be a long drive. If you're gonna do the Taylor, it's a little bit of a tough day trip. So you might want to be staying in Gunnison or Crested Butte or something like that. Yes, sir.
Paul's has another question. He bought a 7-foot 3-weight for the kids to get into the game. He has a private stretch of water on the St. Louis and Fraser. Would you spend more on the rod or reel?
Definitely the rod. The reel is definitely not, something you spend a lot of money on. A Click and Paul reel is great. That's all. I mean, that's all you need. Cool. All right, so we were talking about electric socks. That's a great one if you do get cold feet. Fingerless gloves and mitts. You have to have these. These are definitely something you need. I mean, I try not to fish with gloves as much as possible, but those cold days, you're going to want to, protect those hands. It's more just for tying the knots and dealing with that kind of stuff. I mean, fishing, when you're actually fishing, you're tucking your hands here and there, but I like to have that feel, so I'm not using them so much fishing, but I'm using for intermittently keeping my hands warm. And then hand and feet warmers on those cold days, those super cold days. I rarely use them because I'd rather give them to my clients, but I've definitely had some days where I've had to guide and said, hell, I'm going to check, and it sure helped. So get them in there, put them in there with those waders beforehand when you're gearing up, and use those hand warmers in your pockets. Is actually super helpful on those cold days. So, and they're cheap. They don't cost a whole lot, and they pretty much don't go bad. So, as long as you haven't opened the package. And then small nymph and midge box, super important. You need that small midge box and smaller nymph box as well. And then I definitely have a small dry box. And then the big dries you can probably put away. My big dries go with my streamers, so they're still going with me. But if you want to fish some dry droppers, you can, especially as we get into spring. And really, guys, beautiful thing in Colorado is when March happens, you can probably start fishing dry droppers if you want. A lot of times I will, just because I'm tired of looking at a bobber. So you'll try, as it starts warming up, those fish start getting a little not as deep, and you can get them on a long dry dropper setup. And then yeah, light tippet guys. This is the time of year 4, 5, 6X. Rick even talked yesterday about some 7X if you're fishing down on the Pueblo Reservoir. I don't think I've ever tied a fly on 7X. So maybe I'll have to try that one of these days, but I haven't had to do that yet. And then split shot. Definitely want those weights in your bag, and man, I'll tell you what, if somebody could design a really good split shot dispenser, man, you'd make millions, because I usually just find my split shot all over my bag. So but yes, you need that. So something to have in there. We talked about, I don't have it in here, but 9-foot 5X leaders. I think that's perfect. I mean, the biggest thing is leaders and wintertime is a brand new leader. A lot of times in the wintertime, I really don't love, and depending on the taper, because it's going to have maybe too short a taper. So a lot of times in the winter, I'm actually preferring, I might have a new leader, but I'm going to cut it back a little bit and get tie some tippet on that's going to be more like 4X or 5X, and have a longer portion of that, because I want to have my flies sink really fast. And so having those flies sink very fast with that longer section of tippet is super key, because I want to get those flies down as fast as I can in that zone where I cast. So a lot of times custom building that leader is going to be key. And then ice off paste. Just sold some the other day, and it definitely works, guys. I can't tell it's like a miracle or miraculous, but it works. It helps. And again, another design here and is heated guides, man. If you could get battery in the butt section of your reel of your rod, and then heat those guides, man, you'd make money on that. But again, maybe not a lot of people winter fishing. But another thing I like to do, and this is the day before preparation, is I actually will use some Quell, and I'll actually treat that front section of that line. And this is, Quell is essentially like a silicone, so you're hoping that the water's not going to beat up on that. And then I also treat my guides on my rod, and this is a serious preparation. You're actually like putting it on all your guides, in the front section of your line, but it does help. So if you see it's going to be super windy and cold, these are a couple things that I think really would help in your preparation. And then thermos to hot drinks. It sure is nice to have a bunch of tea or coffee in a nice thermos, keeping you warm throughout the day. Definitely, when I'm guiding, I'm definitely throwing in a thermos with some hot drinks or even soup, and it's a good way to help warm you up in between sessions. And then, of course, lunch, water. You might not have lunch till 3 o'clock, till after the day, but it's sure gonna taste nice. Maybe a little nip of something in your favorite flask, and maybe a beer or two. Even though it's cold, that beer might taste good at lunch. So something to have in your bags or in your cooler for preparation. And then we're gonna get to flies, guys. These are just some of my key flies, and if you were to look at my fly box, you'd see probably a lot more different patterns, variations, but these are just some good ones to have in your box. So pheasant tails. Usually I'm going to have just straight up pheasant tails or flashback pheasant tails or something that looks like a pheasant tail in the sizes 16 to 24. I still like to fish Pats on various rivers. It's a good attractor. So Pat's rubber legs, maybe not in the bigger sizes, but you never know. I mean, I think I catch fish on Pat's rubber legs all winter long on the lower Colorado. Tungstone flashback, kind of like a hare's ear, but in a little bigger size, and it's just heavy and sinks well, and it's got that flash that a lot of times, just like a Rainbow Warrior, can attract those attention. And Rainbow Warrior didn't make this list for some reason, but that's one that I always have. I like to fish them in big sizes, and I'll have them in size like 14s all the way down to 22. So, and that jigged Rainbow Warrior is another great one. That little bit of flash will really attract some attention in the winter and you'll surprise yourself on how many fish are actually eating that. UV Sally, great pattern, also a good attractor pattern. Catch fish every month of the year on that fly. Great one to have in your fly box. The KGB, if you haven't fished it, it's a cool pattern. It's very sparse, sinks real fast, good tungsten bead, and got some unique flash colors on it that fish don't see a lot. So I think it's a good one to have in that box because just people don't fish it or even know about it. It's just really well. Eggs, we talked about those. I'm the next 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, you're fishing eggs or at least having some in your fly box and going to them every once in a while. It's a good source of protein and fish will jump on it. And then worms, can't say enough about those. I don't fish them a ton in the winter, or really period. I just usually don't go to them that often. It's just not my favorite fly to have, but I do have them in my fly box and I will definitely fish them. And then leeches, good pattern. I mean, it looks so good in the water, and it's a good one as you're trying to search on a new spot. An egg worm or a leech as one of your flies to start, see what they're doing, and maybe rotate through. It's a good way to kind of go about the day. And then for those tailwaters, because a lot of those fisheries, those tailwaters we listed are mysis shrimp tailwater. So, having those tailwater or those mysis shrimp in your box is going to be super key. I'm really a big fan of the Charlie's mysis just because it's so sparse and got a wispy tail. Looks really good in the water. If you've ever actually looked and found a mysis, or even a piece of mysis, because sometimes these mysis are coming out in pieces when they're having releases. It's the most, in my opinion, the most realistic looking one in the water. And that's the key for me. Like, it might look realistic out of the water, but in the water, it looks like what a mysis shrimp looks like. And then more nymphs or midges, black beauty. Sometimes in the winter, the less bling is better, or especially on some of these really tough fisheries, for instance, like the dream stream. Some really basic patterns. In fact, one of my flies that I used to have was just super basic, blackish brownish body and a little muskrat head, and that fish that fly did so well, and through many years. And I haven't tied in a while, but super good pattern. So black beauty, super basic pattern. The miracle nymph, cream or black, a combination of those is a good one to throw on behind one of those eggs as you're starting, and just seeing if they're liking light or dark. Miracle or the miracle nymph we just talked about, neon nightmare. They might want flashy, so also something to throw in there in that neon color to kind of bring attention to them. The bling midge has that little flash. It's cream, but it has a little black head and a little flash on there. It's a great pattern too on the blue. The cardinal midge, pearl black. It's got a little flash on there. That pearl kind of reminds you of the pearl on a rainbow warrior, but that fly is a solitude fly, but it does really well for me on the blue and various other fisheries. It can be in that pearl. It's kind of like a miracle, but just has a little more flash or a light colored midge. The mighty midge, that's also a great pattern. And it's how it's tied with those different color heads and that cream body. Super good looking fly. One of the flies I love to use on the blue as well, and this is a cool pattern. It's also a solitude fly. It's a black beauty emerger, and they tie it all the way down to 6, and it's kind of tied on this unique curved hook. But sometimes I feel like if the fish aren't into the emerger, I can just cut that emerger little white tuft off there and just use it as a different looking black beauty on that different hook. And it's a really good technique, really good fly and technique to use. And then brassies and goldie. I say goldie, and I'm going to call it a goldie because it's just gold wire. And it's something I used to tie. It works really good on the blue. Gold wire and a little muskrat head. Super simple. And that brassie can have a muskrat head. Tie them in small sizes. You'll be surprised at how well they work and how easy they are to tie. And, you can tie a dozen in probably less than an hour. And didn't cost you much or any time. And they work really well. So those are a couple of good patterns to have. And then you can't go wrong with that tungsten zebra midge in black use. Yes. Yeah. Question.
What colors for the Mighty Midge and the Bling Midge?
Both colors in that Mighty Midge. I really like to have both of those. I've had situations where one worked better than the other, so I really like to have both. And so, what color was the other one?
Bling Midge.
Bling Midge. I tend to like that cream and or maybe it's tan. I think they're calling it, and the black. The other color is a little too. I think it's brown. It's not necessarily my favorite. So, all right, guys, and then dry flies. Can't go wrong with parachute atoms. And we were talking about on the podcast yesterday. Will's question was whether or not, and I think this directed at Yvonne too, whether or not it has Zaz or not. And Yvonne might know about whether it's got Zaz. So that can also be a high vis with some Zaz. Or just straight parachute atoms. And 16 to 24s. 16 sounds pretty big and it looks pretty big, but I'll even have them up to 12s, just depending on who's fishing them, just so they can see them. And you'll be surprised when one actually comes up and tries to eat that big one. And then your small dries, because really what you're going to be using that parachute atoms for is your sighter for seeing where, or your point fly for seeing where your smaller fly are. And so, the Griffiths gnats, the classic standby, great fly, looks like a cluster or a single midge. But my favorite probably is that Brook Sprout midge. Cream, black are my two favorite colors. I think they got gray as well. I'll also use gray as well. That's a really good color. So a little variants of those. And actually, you can see them quite well. They actually have a pretty good profile. And then you never know. I'm still going to have blue wing olives in my box because maybe you're fishing the tailwater down in Pueblo, and there's a potential year-round blue wing olive hatch down there. So it's a good one to throw, to head down there. And then you never know. You just never know. Some of these, maybe that blue wing looks a little better than your midge pattern. So all of a sudden you're fishing a size 24 blue wing, and it's actually catching fish better than the sprout midge. In fact, I think right on this slide there is a great day of dry fly fishing. In fact, there might even be fish rising in that picture as I'm catching those fish. And Yvonne was there. He saw how good a fishing was, and there were a massive amount of fish rising in that little hole. And then down to the streamers, and these are some of my favorite for the winter. And I typically like to have sparse flies that have a little weight to them and sink real fast. So the little Kim, the meat whistle is one of my favorite because it's pretty sparse and sinks real well, but looks really well. Peanut Envy, it's a double articulated, but it's pretty sparse. Same with the rusty art trombone, and then Goldie, different Goldie than what we were talking about as far as the brassy Goldie. Swim Coach, I've really liked that fly. Even though it is an articulated fly, it does sink really well. And then really, it's hard to beat the Crelix, guys. That fly, the way it sinks, the way it looks, in the different colors it comes in, that fly, is, if I could pick any of them, probably for any day, or every day, it would probably be a Crelix. That's just easy to cast, easy to fish, and sinks really well. So those are all my favorite streamers there. And then we're going to get into some rigging, guys. And we have touched a little bit about how I like to have that longer section of tippet or light tippet to the front there. To your first fly, probably going to be 4X, just so you don't lose a ton of flies. And again, depending on where you're fishing a tailwater where the fish are picky, it might be 5X. You don't want to fish everything on 6X in the tailwater because you're just going to be tying flies on probably. So, that last section might be some 6X to your last little small fly. But nymphing, double or triple nymph rig. I mean, most people are using triple nymph rigs nowadays, so you should. All right, yeah, question, Yvonne.
John Smith has another question. When it's sunny outside with the white winter, will the fish actually rise in the shaded areas, or should I be seeing them rise before I even want to try dry flies?
I usually am looking for fish rising, and I think definitely fish, could be in shadowy spots, but I'm usually not wasting my time unless I know for a fact that I can come back to that spot and always see at some point fish rising on there. But usually I'm not wasting my time until I see fish rising. And if it's a new spot, I'm trying to find that deeper holding water where they potentially might. Because they're not going to rise everywhere. Like for instance, you can catch fish every day through the winter on the Blue River on dry flies all winter long, probably, but they're not going to be rising everywhere. There's only a couple specific areas where they'll eat dry flies and rise to the dry flies. So really, I mean, you can, but you'll be beating more water than you should be. So, all right, all right. So double and triple nymph rig, guys. Experiment with longer sections of tippet to get those flies down. Kind of important on that. And then, let's see here. All right. So then dry flies setups, single dry fly, double dry fly. I think we go through some techniques later. So I was just thinking about what I was going to talk about there. So dry fly, single dry fly, double dry fly. And then something to also think about, sometimes double dry with a little emerger right behind it. That's going to be a good technique if they're not eating that second little dry fly. Maybe they're eating an emerger. So maybe it's one of those Black Beauty emergers as your second fly as well. And that can be a really good technique in the wintertime. And then streamers, I really like that single fly sparse pattern we talked about that sinks fast. And then, sinking line or leader, that's a question. Yvonne, I know is he loves to throw streamers, and he's pretty much always throwing a sinking line. And, he doesn't like to throw that sinking leader. I do. In the wintertime, am I carrying two different rods? Probably not. So, I mean, very rarely am I. So a lot of times I'm going to be switching from a nymphing, in the boat I would be, but I'll be switching from a nymphing rig to maybe a streamer rig. And I'll probably be having to deal with a regular leader and trying to figure out how to get those flies down. So whether it's a sinking leader or, a longer actual leader. And then we're going to talk about some presentations, guys. Nymphing, you're going to be fishing in a deeper, slower holding water. This is where all those fish are pooling up and holding up. Good little picture on that slide from the Arkansas River, that particular run. It doesn't look that deep and pooled, but man, it's actually pretty deep, and the fish really pot up in there. And then you can definitely fish those slow ends of the holes, and definitely it's worth checking out as you jump into that hole. Definitely throw a few in there. But those fish might be a little picky in the very, very end of the slow hole. They still might be in that tail out. So swinging flies a lot of times through the tail out is a great thing to try. As you approach that hole, though, fishing the back end sometimes can be a little tricky, and those fish almost might spook out. So a lot of times I'm trying to find that top or middle portion of that hole, and that's where I'm going to start trying to figure out where I need to stand. And that's a little bit of moving up, a little bit of moving down. And then with a technique, what I call slackline nymphing. And that's essentially going to be basically casting upstream, but then letting that fly line cast to or float to you for a second. And then as it gets to you, you're going to do a big upstream mend and then a stack mend or multiple mends. I like to say to people, and then as it goes by you, now it's going to create this J in your line, and then you're going to shake out extra line. And as that fly is coming to you, you got to be ready to pounce if there's a strike right, next to you in front of you, because you got all that big stack mend and that extra line. And then as it starts going below you and starts creating that J, you're going to start shaking extra line. I like to paint a zigzag or a Z on the water. So I'm just using my rod tip to throw some extra line on the water. And then I'm going to start shaking that line out and just let it drift below me. And you're really looking for a fish to pick up that anywhere from like right next to you or right in front of you to below you. So this is just a way to help get those flies down fast. Um, so this is a great technique. And then as it floats all the way down below you, you can actually, as that line starts straightening out, you might get them on a little bit of movement and on the swing, and then you'll strip back in line and do it all over again. Yes, question, Yvonne.
We got a couple questions, and I think you've touched on a couple of the things, so I just want to ask them more explicitly. So you've sort of spoke to this a little earlier. Brandon's asking dry dropper rigs with some of those nymphs you were talking about. That's the first question.
Yep. So, we were kind of talking earlier about it is most of the time what happens is those dries tend to ice up. And a lot of times, dead on winter, you might not be, if you're fishing a larger river like the Arkansas or the Colorado, you're probably not getting deep enough to where those fish really are. And so you might catch a few fish, but you're not going to catch as many fish as you want. And then with that ice potential buildup on that dry fly, that's just going to be frustrating as it keeps sinking throughout the day. That double dry rig where you're fishing that second fly with a merger, that can be a technique. Or if you're really seeing good activity on the dry, on the surface there, maybe you fish, a size 18 parachute Adams and a small radiation betas or something behind that, and you never know, you might be picking up fish like that too. So using a little variation, double drop or dropper fishing technique. Yeah.
Scott has a question about water types. So you talked about slow moving water. Can you expand on that and describe a little bit more the water types you expect them to feed? And then when can you expect that good feeding behavior? So I know you talked about it a little bit there, but you just wrap that all in a nice little bow.
Right. So, the super slow water, if you're finding, I think even Scott, I saw a part of his presentation, he was talking about how, if it's the really slow end of a hole, those fish just have so much time to look at your flies that a lot of times you might try it for a little bit, but if the fish are just being so spooky, for instance, fishing Cheeseman Canyon, you look down there, you're like, oh my God, look at that fish holding in that slow water. And you go down and you keep fishing for it and it just won't eat. And it's really, you got all these different swirls and it's just causing those flies and line to move, not the way that you want it to. And so, looking for a little bit more moving water, but maybe not the super fast either. Maybe right where the super fast starts slowing down. But then the nice thing with that technique that I was showing you is you can actually get your flies into the end or slower water, but you're not sitting right there. You're actually fishing from well above. And by painting all that extra line on there, you're watching that line just slowly straighten out, but it's not straightening out by you dragging it. It's just slowing out with the drift. So it's a good technique for trying to fish. You get to fish everything. You get to fish the top of the hole when you're up in the drop to right where you are, to all the way to the end, and then even swing in through that tail out. And so it's a really good technique for fishing all that whole run. It's a little hard with your hook set because you have all that extra line out. But one thing that I always tell people is if you're not doing a lot of this, you're not going to be getting the strikes. So something to think about there. And then what was the other portion of that question there, Yvonne?
When can you expect to see good feeding behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, really, in the wintertime, I'm pretty much throwing the thermometer out. I'm really looking at what's going on. If there's ice flow, number one, it's going to be tough to get your flies through that ice flow. So I'm not worried about that. These fish are super sensitive to that warming of the day. So even a degree or 2 degrees of temperature, they're like, oh man, it's on, it's time to eat. So, just even that sun coming up, just the middle of the day is going to do enough to make those fish want to eat.
Question from Gabriel: Winter dries on the blue? Question mark.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. We touched about it briefly. The tailwater has a couple spots where you can have some great dry fly fishing. You've got to hunt those spots out though, and then all winter long up in the Blue River by Breckenridge, you can find fish rising. So a little more technical stream because it's a real small water. But I've caught fish all winter long on dry flies. So you know get out there, check it out, spend the time, walk the rivers, look for the deeper water, and really just keep your fish rising. Sometimes it's really subtle, and you might not even have noticed it, and then you maybe get a different angle on the water that you're looking at, and instead of looking upstream at that hole, you're looking downstream, and you're like, oh, there's noses all over the place. So something to think about there.
I'll sort of chime in there. That one day we were on the Eagle, it was very cold. There was ice flowing down the river for the majority of the day. We were catching them on nymphs, but we were like sitting in a couple holes, catching them pretty good. Wasn't expecting to see dry flies whatsoever. We turned that corner. We were just about to leave, right? We were like, all right, we had a good day.
Yeah.
Just about to leave. We turned that corner, and we just saw there were like 15 fish just eating everywhere. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was don't know till you go.
And to add to that, I've had probably one of the most unique and amazing dry fly fishing in ever. It was -6, and we were at the Dream Stream, and the guy was saying that he's like, "I'm from Michigan. This is not cold. Let's do it." And we got out there, and it was dry flies all day, and you could literally see the pods of midges on the water. It was just crazy how many bugs were on the water, and just that weird weather scenario caused that phenomenon, and it was quite amazing. So yeah, dry flies. Spend the time, walk the rivers, look for the holding water. Where Yvonne and I was, it was an obvious pooled up slower, and that's where you might, talking back to slow water, maybe not great for nymphing, but you might have better action dry fly fishing on those slower pockets and holes. And because we came around the corner and it was just fish rising everywhere on the Eagle. So
one more question, Zeke. Well, there's going to be more, but this is one more. So sort of calling into question whether or not those dry dropper rigs would be freezing. Does normal silicone floating not keep water and ice from building up?
It does. It does to a point. So like a big chubby, it's got a lot of that fluffy white material there, and after a while, that silicone just starts not being going away. It's not working anymore, and it's just going to start. All you have to do, it has to be just cold enough for water to start staying on the fly and that air temperature to start freezing it. So it can work for a little bit, but good chance it's not going to work, especially if it's super cold. If it's 30s, mid to high 30s, you're probably okay. But again, I think the biggest thing there is whether or not you're getting into where those fish are. If it's a full on and their fish aren't rising and there's activity towards the surface, and you're trying to tough it out with a dry fly dropper, you just might not be deep enough. So, that's something to think about. If the fish are coming to the surface, you see activity, you might be able to have some action with the regular dry dropper rig. All right. So we talked about those hook sets. Might take a little time to get used to. But really, if you're not trying that, and try that slackline nymphing. Works good for me. It's how I get a lot of my clients on fish, especially the Dream Stream is a great place to do it. The Blue as well works really well. Just got to get used to those hook sets. And then now we're going to dry flies, which you just kind of talked about. So, looking for rising fish midday, and a lot of times towards that end of the day as well, as we just talked about the Eagle. So a lot of times that activity really doesn't, the dry fly activity doesn't happen early in the morning. It's more towards that midday, end of day. And then you'll see that midge hatch. And that's, so keep your eyes out. Look for any little dimples. Look for, and again, you might not see them when you're looking upstream or downstream. You have to change your point of view. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's fish rising all over the place. So, just keep your eyes open, listening for any, noises that would indicate a rise. And then pinpoint those rising fish. Whether that's a double dry, whether you're fishing upstream. I think of most of that day when we were on the Eagle, which is right there in that picture as well, was fishing, an upstream presentation to them. But sometimes you might even use a downstream presentation, very similar to that slackline nymphing. And then using that double dry, so that larger parachute out is going to help you find that brook sprout midge or Griffiths gnat. That also said, sometimes those fish can really, that bigger dry fly causes a little drag in your line, a little tension in that other fly, and fishing a double dry might not be the way to go. So you might have to try to tough it out and see that little tiny fly, or at least make your best educated guesses when you think your fly is in the money spot, and set the hook on anything that's close. So again, we kind of talked about that slackline nymphing technique. Works also good for fish in that downstream position. There's a couple places on the Blue, for instance, that it's just really hard to actually approach those fish from below them, and so sometimes it's easier to get that downstream presentation with that slackline technique. And then streamers, guys, fish might not be on the banks. A lot of times people want to fish streamers all the time, and it can be productive, but now you might have to focus on a little bit different water. So now maybe you're looking for that deep holding water. You're looking for lurky banks, again, moving a little slower. And then more mending and stack mending to get those flies down, and then slow retrieves out of those deep holding water. So, varying those retrieves, though, you might find them going for fast stuff. But a lot of times in the winter, think about trying those slow retrieves first. Or maybe you try that quick retrieve first because you only have to do a couple, and then you're like, all right, this is not working. Let's go to those slow retrieves with some hesitations. And then something a lot of people try to always forget about is sometimes throwing a streamer with a dead drift. It's not a bad technique, and you'll surprise yourself. Get a good eat, and it also helps you figure out where those fish might be. Maybe you get that dead drift, and your fly's ticking the bottom, and then one eats, and you're like, oh man, those fish are real deep. So let's try that again, or do that same thing and then slow retrieve, and that can be the trick of the day right there. Any other questions, guys? I'm getting pretty much at the wrap-up point, and I'm sure we got some more questions here. No questions, Yvonne?
I just put out the last call for questions, so maybe we can shoot the shit for a little bit. You want to show us your favorite dance? Please don't. Please stop.
What? Well, I can dance.
Did your mom tell you?
I just might have. Yeah, my mom did. I might do my duck face. You haven't been using that. You haven't used that photo.
What photo? Oh yeah, the duck face photo. It still needs to get edited, Zeke.
Nice.
All right, so nice. I think we're getting close to the time when the last calls for questions would come in. Let me give it a couple more seconds, Zeke. Zeke, you talked about the podcast. What were you talking about with Will and Rick yesterday?
Yeah, so podcast yesterday we were talking about kind of similar. Just some basics of like where I came from and whatnot, but then really just talking about double sport days. Like where I live, that was one of the things that is, I can go out and split board in the morning and then go fishing in the afternoon, or vice versa. whether it's fishing the blue. So some pretty cool stuff. And then we also talked about Pueblo Reservoir, fish below the reservoir and maybe go mountain biking. That was kind of fun. Really we touched on, and uh, I touched on it at the beginning, is part of the fun in winter fishing is really just going out for an adventure. And whether it's driving the trough road like we've done before, or driving down to during Snowmageddon and watching all the avalanche shoots as we're going down there, and then trying to go camping, and then not being able to camp, but we caught fish that day. We caught fish on dry flies. So that's the fun parts of right there. And it's an adventure. That's why we do what we do. And one of the reasons why I like to go fishing in the winter is like, I haven't been down there. I want to go see that place in a while, and maybe I can see some dirt. As I've been seeing snow all winter, I haven't seen any dirt. I want to go see some dirt and go down and see some dirt and dry, and maybe a cactus, and or just sit in the sun. And sometimes it's a bust, but you know what? You had your beer on your bank and you're feeling pretty good about it. Very rare is it ever a full bust. You can find somewhere to fish. Some of those days of learning what Trout Creek's all about was literally probably days where I was like, I don't know, going to the Arkansas, but it doesn't not inspiring. Oh, look, there's water over there, and so checked it out. There's so many cool places to fish, and then if you want to drive far, those are all pretty close from Denver or the Summit County, but you know you can drive a ton farther and go to check out other places in Colorado. And the Gunnison, essentially below below Gunny Gorge, is a tailwater essentially, and you can fish there most of the winter long. So a ton of options if you don't mind driving and going checking it out. And Gunny, that area could be 20 degrees warmer, could be colder too, but that's part of the fun. It's just looking on a map.
Okay.
I mean, for me,
Zeke, I'm going to interrupt you. This is the last question, and this will be a question we both can answer together. Can we expect another Santa video this year?
We didn't talk about it. We haven't finalized. We were supposed to talk about that. Yeah. When was that?
On Monday? Potentially we will shoot it on Monday or Tuesday. I have a procedure, a surgical procedure occurring tomorrow that may or may not prevent me from getting out to film. So, fingers crossed, Zeke, the guide Santa, will be making an appearance. If it does come, it will come on Christmas.
Yes. Santa sightings would be cool. Yeah. That'd be really fun.
So, appreciate everybody tuning in. Thank you, Zeke.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. Go out for some adventures. Look on a map. Go fishing. Call the Denver shop. Call the Frisco shop. Ask for tips and tricks. Look at Yvonne's outlooks for fishing, his 10-day forecast. Look at my 10-day forecast. And get out there. Have some fun. Happy holidays. And thanks for all the support, guys. And really appreciate you guys. How was it? I kept getting this Rick